Hello, this is the Bite Weasel, and in this video we'll be continuing our Roblox Tycoon game by looking at making some client-side UI to track various numbers. So hopefully you've been following along in the series and you know that we currently have quite a decent tycoon. Like we have the ability to copy a template into various plots. We have a sign that gets sort of updated with the name of who owns the tycoon. We've got these chunky feeling buttons. And then last episode, we sort of spent some time adding little effects like sounds to whether you're failing to buy an item or you successfully buy an item. We have the effect of the label sort of floating up into the air and disappearing, pop sounds, we added music, all sorts of stuff that just make nice little touches to make our tycoon game feel like we've put some good amount of effort in. But the one piece that's sort of missing in terms of our look and feel of the game is that we currently have no client-side UI, right? We do have our money that is currently tracked up here, but in most tycoons, what you see is that there is some UI that sort of follows your camera as you look around, which also tracks your money. But it can also track other things like the number of rebirths you have, how many sort of like in-game coins you might have collected, or various different attributes that, your tycoon might be using. So in this episode, we're going to look at how to add and update sort of numbers that are coming from our profile store. So if you remember, we have inside our data script the ability to sort of load and save information from a data store, and we're using the profile service sort of library for that. And so we have a bunch of information that we sort of track. We could add client-side UI for this information. So that's what we're going to do. And we're going to start with the money. So what does that look like? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Inside your hierarchy in the Explorer, there is a starter GUI folder. And inside there, you can add a screen GUI. And basically, this is a big area where you can add text labels and images and all the same things that you can do with a billboard GUI or a surface GUI, which we saw last time. But this time, it will stick to the camera, right? So no matter where you look, this entire area where your sort of game scene is will have a screen GUI object on it. So now you can add something to that. And the first thing that I like to add is sort of a frame that acts as a container for various other things. So you'll see that no matter where I look, this frame is sort of attached to the screen there. So we're going to position this sort of like in that same area. So if you go down to position and you can sort of pick 0 on the x-axis because we want it on the left-hand side, and then on the y-axis halfway down. But if you remember, like how we saw with the surface GUI, that position is currently talking about the top left corner at 0, 0. Instead, I want it to position at the middle by the middle, so it's directly in the center of the screen. So you can go to the anchor point and you can say, I don't want you to think about it in terms of the top corner. I want you to think about it in terms of the center. So now I have this sort of positioned directly in the center of my screen on the left-hand side by that anchor point. And then you can sort of change the size as well. So we're going to think of it in terms of 0.2 of the screen's X and maybe 0.1 of its Y. That makes it this big. And that's okay, I guess. You can spend more time doing this, of course, when you come to design your own. But I've got to do it kind of quick for a video so you don't get bored. Background transparency, we'll turn it all the way up so we can't see it. That's great. That's a nice container, but we need a text label in there that's going to show whatever value that we're trying to display. So for us, it's going to be the money, at least to begin with. So again, we'll turn off the background transparency by turning it all the way up. And then we'll just sort of make the size the same size as the container, right? So the full size of the container, we'll change the font to the same one, the same one that we've been using the whole time. We'll scale it up. We'll give an example text of like $1,000. And we'll change the text color to white, I guess. And let's have some stroke on it. So there you go, a nice number value next to you on the UI somewhere. And what we can do is sort of say that the X alignment of the text, instead of being centered on that text box, is to the left. And I think that's good because now as your money value gets bigger, it's going to stretch this way. Like more zeros will be added onto the end instead of it sort of floating in the middle of the screen, sort of expanding both left and right. So this is good. You could also, if you wanted to, move it away from the exact left-hand side. You could move it, a fraction across, and you could also fit an icon in there if you wanted. So you could do something like adding a image label, making that image label sort of 0.1 and 1, and then setting it to something, right? You would have to go into the toolbox and grab an icon, but for now, that's just an example. You can go away and do it and look better on your sort of game. But for now, I think this is an okay example. In fact, I do want something, but instead of an image label, because I don't have an image, I'm just going to add another text label. Okay, and you'll see why in a second. What I'm going to do is change the background color to yellow. Whoops, that was the frame. I'm going to change the text box's background color to yellow. I'm going to change the font so it is scaled. I'm going to have it be the same sort of font that we use everywhere else. I'm going to change it to $. And then what I'm going to add on here on our text label, which is really an image label, I'm going to add this thing called a UI corner. And this can actually allow us to round this text label out. So we can change this to 1. And if we make now this text label a little smaller, like in the size, we can say 0.1 and 1. We're going to get this, what looks kind of like an icon. And you can sort of spend more time and find an image maybe from the toolbox, to get it looking good on yours. And I'm just messing around with the numbers to try and get it look a little more like a coin. But hopefully you just sort of find an icon from somewhere instead of messing around too much like this. I also want it centered, which is why I'm now changing the anchor point and the position. There, that's good. So imagine this was your icon and not a text label, but it's okay. And we'll just shift this along a little bit more so it looks like that. So there you go. You've got an icon now, and you've got a number value next to it. Obviously, find an image from the toolbox or make your own so it looks a little better, but you get the idea. There's an icon and there's a number next to it. So there you go. But now how the heck do we update these things? Well, we need a way for each client to control its own UI, which makes sense. And it's very similar to the way that we needed a script for each client to control its own effects. We now need a script to control their own GUI. So we can go into Starter Player scripts, and add a new local script. And I guess we'll just rename that to be client GUI, right? And we could say GUIs, GUIs. And from there, we're going to need to get access to this screen GUI that we just added. So very similar to how the client FX got access to the sound service and grabbed all the sounds, we're going to need access to this screen GUI and all the labels under it. But the way that you sort of access GUI is a little different to how you access other things in the hierarchy. Because this starter GUI folder isn't the actual thing that each player has. Rather, it's more like a template. And when a player joins the game, Roblox will clone this starter GUI template and place it under each individual player. So you have a copy of what is essentially this template. So we can't say game get service starter GUI because that'll give us access to the template. Instead, we need to get access to the player's actual local copy of this GUI. And the way that you do that is actually with the player's service. So we've seen the player service before. We can grab a copy of that. And now what you can say is players.localPlayer, which means whichever current player this script is running for. Because remember, each local script will be copied to each client. So you can say, whoever my local player is, I want to grab access to your player GUI. And this will be a copy of this starter GUI template. And this is the actual one that will be displayed on their screen. So it's the one that we want to grab access to. So we'll say local GUI equals that. And then we'll say GUI wait for child and ScreenGUI, because that is what we're grabbing at the root of our template. We don't really need the GUI itself. Instead, we need to wait for the child for frame, and we really only want the money text value. So we'll say local money, money label, I guess, is the player's particular instance of this GUI, then wait for the ScreenGUI, wait for the frame, and wait for the money. The reason that we're using wait for child rather than find for child or using a dot is because this is happening on the client, and this thing might not be replicated. It might not have cloned it yet when this script starts running. So always remember that on the client local scripts, you need to wait for child. And there we go. Now we can say money label dot text equals, and we can say whatever the heck we want it to say. Right now, it doesn't really matter, but you can imagine it's going to get updated as we go. So now if I start the game, what we should see is that value that was 100,000 or whatever I'd set it to is now updated by our client script. And that's good, but it's not going to change as we grab money in our game. We need something to tell this, hey, you need to update to a new value. Because right now it's just hard-coded to be 200. So how can we add some sort of event that says, hey, this value has changed, you should update it? Well, for money, because we've put this in the leader stats, and if you recall, leader stats get put into the hierarchy. Under your particular player, there's a folder called leader stats, and under there, there's a number value, that is the money. Those get cloned to the client. So what we could do is write the exact same code that we have in our factory already. So inside our factory, we grab access to the leader stats, we grab access to that money value, and we add a property change signal that says, hey, whenever the property has changed, and that property being the value, do something. So we could do this. We could do this on the client side, because on the server, when this value gets changed, that ends up automatically propagating from the server to the client. And so you could do that. You could definitely grab this, look up the leader stats from the player, look up the number value called money, and then add a property change signal. And that would work. But it would only work for things that are stored inside your hierarchy. And right now, that's fine for something like money, but it's not fine for anything else that might be stored in our profile. So here, this is the profile that gets stored to the data store and gets pulled out of the data store when we load. And we're doing that using profile service, that library. And you can look back at the previous episodes to sort of see how that worked. And right now, our money is stored in there, but it's really a copy of the leader stats. So if we were to add something else that isn't stored in the leader stats, like products sold, which is going to be a number that constantly updates every single time the seller sells an item. So we could say profile.product sold plus equals 1. So every single time you sell an item inside the seller script, that number is going to update. But that number is going to update and get stored to the data store, but it's not going to appear in the hierarchy at any point. So we can't exactly say, okay, grab the leader stats, grab the product sold value and listen for a property changed, because we're not storing it in the leader stats. And you certainly could, but as your game gets bigger and you're going to want to be tracking even more things on your UI, it doesn't make sense to start putting absolutely everything in leader stats, because your leaderboard will get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it will just sort of look crazy. So instead, let's do something that I think makes a little more sense. And that is an actual event that can get fired when that data changes. So no matter if the data changed from a leader stats or it changed in our profile or something else happened, like we got loaded, we can just fire an event that means, hey, client, you need to update your GUI because some data has changed. And that makes it a little easier for us because, one, we can use the same mechanism that we sort of do in our client FX when an item is bought, but also because it allows us to think about things in terms of a single event rather than having to grab leader stats and think about number values and worrying about whether Roblox has replicated it or not, because we'll control it ourselves. So we've seen this pattern before. We'll go into replicated storage, a place that both the client and server can access, and we'll add a new remote event. And this event we'll call data update. Right? So whenever there's a data update, the server can fire it and the client can listen to it. And how do you listen to it? Well, very similar to what our client FX was doing. We can listen to replicated storage, which means we'll need to get access to replicated storage, that shared position that both the client and the server can access. We'll say wait for child, data update. We'll listen to the client-side event by connecting a handler to it. And what will we get in our handler? Well, probably not a location. Instead, we'll probably get the data that has been updated, right? And so now what we can do is we can really update our money label with that value. So we'll say it equals $sign plus data.money. And that is pretty straightforward. But now we need something to fire this update. So how can we do that? Well, for money, it's actually pretty straightforward. Inside our factory script, we're already sort of updating the profile when the money leader stat value changed. So what we could do is say replicated storage, which we don't have access to. So let's grab that. Same way that we do here. Paste it at the top so we get that service. We'll say replicated storage. Oops, I've gone past it. Replicated storage dot data update, because we're on the server. We don't actually have to wait because it'll already be there by the time the server starts. Fire client. Which particular client? Well, the player, that's money who's just changed. And then we'll fire the profile. We don't actually have the profile, but we're getting it right here. So we'll sort of refactor this to say local profile equals get data for the player. And then we'll set profile money equal to be something. And then we'll fire that out. So in theory now, when I play the game, the first time that we get money, so you see it's not set yet because we haven't had an event, but the first time when we sell something, we update the money. We now also fire that event, and we can update our UI. So there you go. Pretty straightforward, and it works in a very similar way to when we sell something and we tell the client, hey, I want you to show a nice floating label. Now when we sell something, we change the money and we say, hey, client, I want you to update any client UI you have because the data is updated. Now, obviously, we were having a problem when you first log into the game. Nothing told us to update the data. And that just means you need to pick a new place to fire this event and say, hey, the profile data has been updated. And where do we do that? Well, really, we want to do it as soon as the sort of profile has been loaded. right? Whenever the profile has been loaded, okay, that number value has been updated, so give that to the client. So we could do that inside our data script. Down here, under player added, when the profile has finally been loaded, we could certainly do that. We could say replicated storage dot data update and fire it for the player, and here is the profile's data that has changed. So we could say game.getService, replicated storage. And now, when the player is added, we fire that event and it will update to the initial item. And I think that works nice. Because now, whenever the item, the money is changed, whether that's when it first gets loaded from the server or when we sell something, we can sort of send that event. But it does mean one thing. Let's say we had something that's just in our profile service. So you know that inside our data, we added something like product sold and we updated that when it got sold. How do we move this to the client? Well, we could simply fire it every time something in the profile changed. So we could say a data update here because we changed something in the profile. And that will also work. So now if we were to go here and we were to make a copy of this frame, let's just duplicate it. Let's call it sold frame or something. We'll move it down a little bit. So if I go to position and I move it down just a smidgen, and you can change the icon. I guess because it's a text label for us, we can just change the string, but you would have to find a new icon, I guess. I'll say P for products. And instead of it money, it's sort of like sold. That will be the name of it. So this is just going to be a count of how many products we've ever sold. And you might not want to track that on your UI, but it gives you an idea of how you would track things that aren't leader stats. So now we go into client UI. We can grab access to that sold frame and get the sold label, and we'll call it sold label. And then we'll simply update sold label.text to be an empty string combined with products sold. Is that what we called it? I think so. If we go back into our data script, products sold, products sold. Yep. So now, whenever the seller script updates the product sold value, we're also going to fire that data updated, which means in theory, the client should also get that value. So let's take a look. So this should sort of change that. Yeah. As we sell money, which gets updated in the leader stats, we send an event. And whenever we change this value, we also send that same event, which means if I start spending money now, the money goes down, but the product value will only ever go up. This is how many we've sold. But it does work. So that's how you can sort of update client-side UI in a simple fashion. You just add your own remote event, and you have a client-side script listen to that event, and then you have a server script fire that event whenever something changes. So right now, we're firing it in 3 different places. We fire it whenever the money's leader stat value changes. We fire it whenever the data first ever gets loaded. And we fire it when we sell something because we're updating something else. And I think that's fine for now. It allows us to have 2 different things tracked on a UI. One of them isn't in the leader stats, so we know that works. And we know whenever we change the profile data to just sort of fire that event and have the UI update. And I think next time we'll maybe look at making that a little cleaner with some refactoring. But for now, yeah, there you go. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, like and subscribe, leave a comment, ring that notification bell, all that good stuff, and I will see you next time.